various petitions to the state, especially for indemnification after the occupation. There are literally hundreds of boxes, mostly in municipal and departmental archives, of people writing to state authorities demanding various amounts of money for the damages that were caused to them as a result of the invasion and occupation, both in 1814 and then again from 1815 into the occupation of Guarantee up to 1818. And these go on up until the 1850s. And I think they allow you to see not only people's narrative of the suffering that they experienced under foreign occupation, but they also connect to this question of memory because they're sort of framing this particular worldview they have of the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and then also of their impressions or their national sentiments toward the Germans or the Russians or the English, which I think then again carry into subsequent conflicts, and especially the Franco-Prussian War. They're sort of the framework that people have when they enter this new conflict a little bit later in the 19th century. So I guess, a couple things I would emphasize is one, the persistence of I think one thing that using these sorts of documents shows us is the persistence of everyday routines and everyday concerns amidst conflict. I think that comes through very clearly in these kinds of sources and helps to show that even in the midst of dramatic conflict, there's a sort of continuity in everyday life, and people are trying very hard to preserve that continuity in everyday life in every way they can, and that comes through in these sorts of sources perhaps more than in other kinds of sources. And then, like I said, the role of such documents, especially these petitions, in forging relationships between the individual citizen and the nation state, but then also in setting a framework for historical memory of events, for a half century or more later. So just quickly, a couple questions, and then we'll launch into general discussion. Just to try to draw all of this together, I'm wondering if you could consider broader questions about how such ego documents of conflict compare to similar sorts of self-narratives during peacetime, whether there's any difference in ego documents that are written in times of conflict versus ego documents that are written in times of peace. And this was in relation particularly to what Whitney had to say. I'm wondering if the self is more conflicted or fragmented in times of conflict than in times of peace. This notion of the fragmented or conflicted or dramatized self, is that something that's especially true in conflict, or is that just always the case that selves are fragmented and represent themselves as such and dramatize themselves in ways that are often contradictory, or is there something particular going on in times of war? And then flipping the question around, what do self-narratives reveal about war that we can't understand from other sorts of more official or public sources? If we could just maybe pull out some more general conclusions about how this can advance the history of military conflict in new directions. So I'll stop there, and we really welcome your comments and questions and discussion too. And we have a microphone.
Two.
Okay. And then please speak into it so that we get you on the recording.
Well, since I'm holding a microphone, I might as well say something. Is this working? Okay. I was wondering if any or all of you might address, when I first saw the title of the talk, of the panel, excuse me, I was thinking of Ego Histoire. If you know the work of Pierre Nora, who 30 years ago put together this book that he called Ego Histoire, and he got together about a dozen French historians to talk about themselves as historical figures, and especially in terms of some of the points that Shannon made about what you do with interviews. And I'm thinking of some of my own work where I've been looking at interview notes that I took of some of the people involved in the Second World War. I hate to say this, it's 40 years ago, and then how you reinterpret your own work. And I was just wondering if any of you, as you think about ego documents, which I now see you're thinking of in a somewhat different sense, whether you would go one step further or have gone one step further and kind of look at your own work in a certain sense on whichever period you're looking at as a kind of ego document, because of course we all have ourselves and our conflicts and our backgrounds and all of that sort of thing. So I just was curious whether this has come up in your informal conversations and any of your own thinking or whatever.
I think I have kind of thought about it because conducting interviews, and especially when I was in grad school, people saying, well, first you're young, right? You're an American.
I heard both of those.
You're not Jewish, right? So there were layers of, and then I had to think, okay, what is my role in asking questions? Then how do I represent what they're saying? But I think a lot of what I think about too is how do you use them? Are these just illustrations of a point you're trying to make, or can you do something else with them? But also, you're the one asking the questions, so the questions that you're asking shape the story that you're going to tell as well. So there's all of these things that you're thinking about, I think, when conducting the interview, but then also using them.
It's a dynamic process, though, in the sense that, again, using my own experience, I look back and I kept very careful notes at the notes and the questions, and I thought, gee, I've asked all the wrong questions. And because, of course, one's own historical perspective changes over time, and I don't know if anybody, any of you want to address these questions.
We have another question.
Would you pass back the microphone?
I had a couple of thoughts. One was in answers to Bert's question. I think a lot about who I am and what I bring to the questions I ask about history. And I talk to my students about this too, is that who you are is going to shape the question, so you better know who that is, at least somewhat. So I know, for example, that I've written on religious conflict for my entire career. And I come out, as an adult, have been a Unitarian, which is really concerned with religious tolerance and just general tolerance. And so when I wrote about Alsace, I wrote a lot about accommodation and how the different groups got along. And I had to ask myself continually whether I'm predisposed to want to see people get along. But I'm working in Languedoc now, and I see a lot of conflict, and I wouldn't make the same argument. So hopefully that takes me off the hook, and that I'm not just reading my own sort of ethical and religious sense of the importance of tolerance into what I did on Alsace, because I really have been able to see something different. But I think whether we write on women's history or we have a political viewpoint that predisposes us to ask certain questions. I think that certainly was true in the 60s of a lot of people who did labor history or worked on socialism as well, or coming out of a sense of social justice. I think all those things are really important to know why you're asking certain questions. The second thing I would say is in regards to the question about peace, both about peace, but also the different layers, is that because I have been working on Languedoc in the 19th century post-Concordat, and wanting to know about Protestant Catholic tensions there were a lot of Brits who missionaries who went into France after 1814 to try to re-Christianize and revitalize Protestantism and to with sort of the civilizing mission idea. And I started using those sources, and they're all letters about really to have their description of what these Protestants were like. But I've ended up writing some other articles about these British people because their encounter in peacetime now with the Protestants and Catholics, they start thinking about themselves as British in a different way because they're encountering the French, who they see very much as the other. It's very amusing what they think about the French and how uncivilized they are, and how they're bringing enlightenment to the French. But you see them constructing their own identities. So there's ended up being two layers and two different projects out of dealing with the same set of sources as a result. So.
Could I ask just a very simple question. I mean, I'm really impressed by the different types of documents you've all used to try to put in
May I
context.
just say something?
Yeah.
Because I think there's a problem. The mic is just for them. It's not broadcasting. So I think people are having a
speak
hard
up.
time hearing when you're talking into the mic because it's not amplified. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, as I was saying, I'm very impressed by all the documents and the sort of things you folks have been putting into context to try to understand not only what was happening at the time, but how the memory of these events shapes people's thinking about this subsequently. I was just wondering, it's a very simple question, because I'm myself trying to look at some letters during World War I for the first time using different kinds of correspondence. Do you see sort of a hierarchy of certitude of these different types of documents? I mean, letters are pretty immediate, and I've always used them when I do intellectual biographies because they give a kind of texture underneath published text, and they're self-fashioning, to be sure, but they're self-fashioning in a very different way than a memoir, than an oral interview that's done later, than restitution documents, which have another agenda. I mean, so it's a very simple question, but I'm wondering if anyone would care to respond to that.
I think it depends on certitude about what. I guess that's all I have to say. Right? I mean, different documents are going to address different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think letters are, you know, and you have the carnet de guerre, right? You have diaries, those too, and even I'm thinking those, because those are really intimate. It's really, you're just telling the story to yourself, because I'm thinking of these guys talking about their sexual or amorous adventures to their friends back home, or even their parents and their mothers, incredibly. But it's the exotic, like white women. Wow, you know. I mean, so there's. But at the same time, I'm thinking these are young men talking about sex, sometimes to other young men. What does that mean, right? It's immediate, right? But it's but even in a diary, let's say, right, which is okay. I'm talking to myself. I don't have to show off, maybe. But if a certain kind of person is writing a diary, that's one thing. But if you know, Charles de Gaulle is writing a diary, he thinks other people are going to read it, right? So I think every source, in fact, he's sure other people are going to read it. Even if he's 7 or 8 years old, he's sure he's going to be a historical figure, and people are going to be interested. So I think the way I try to take all of those things and figure out, okay, what are all of the factors at play here, and then hierarchize the documents individually. I think, frankly, I wouldn't say diaries, letters, censorship, that kind of thing. I would take the totality of the circumstances surrounding every document and figure that out, because I think some letters could be less reliable than a published memoir, or vice versa. Right? You could have anything could happen, I suppose.
I'm not sure to what extent this is applicable to all four of you. Shannon, when you were talking about oral interviews, is when it came to me, and I'm finding it so interesting that I can't help ask you, even if it doesn't resonate. When I teach our methodology class, and we talk about doing oral interviews, I think it's Linda Shope's, I think it's her book, where she raises this idea of an iconic story. And what she means by that is that you have your list of questions as the interviewer, and she says give a chance to just pause and have them talk, and maybe even just nod your head once in a while, because if you give them enough time, they will start telling stories that are iconic to them, that reveal things about them, and it can be about just about anything. And so it occurred to me, I was thinking about that in an oral interview, but then I wondered in these other ECHO documents whether or not you ran across iconic stories, and if the issue was war, did the voice then, does it have a different relevance, or does it have a different interpretation because it's iconic to the person talking about it, versus if they see themselves as a spectator or a bystander, and it doesn't exactly resonate with something that's key to their identity. I hope I've expressed that right, but I found myself very curious about that.
Well, but I think when you're saying letting people talk, but I think one of the things you find interesting, especially with these Holocaust interviews that come much later, that there's not an iconic story not only for the individual, but there's the iconic story of the Holocaust, right? And what people expect to hear about it. And, you know, for example, like when I was asking people about, you know, daily life in the limousine, they're like, no one's ever asked before, because it's not a concentration camp, or it's not the death camp, or I wasn't deported, or, you know, it's not the typical story that you associate with it. So then I think that person also has to figure out how does their story fit into that bigger story as well. And then they might say something to you like, but my story's not important. And then how do you get the person to talk about the things that are important to you? It's like those daily details that no one else thinks are important is what you think is important. But it's, I think there's that iconic story for the person, but there's also the bigger story, and how do those things fit together? And I don't know about in other kinds of sources, probably in memoirs as well, especially Holocaust memoirs, right? There's the, you know, there's usually pre-war, here's what happened when the Nazis came, here's this, and then there's usually at the end the triumphal, I survived, and, you know, and if it differs from that, people tend to get uncomfortable. You know, there's not a lot of people who implicate themselves for, you know, yeah, I stole stuff from other people, right? You don't see that a lot in there too. So I think in memoirs you would maybe have that, but I don't know in other.
Just to add a moment, when thinking back to Rachel, one of your, Kathleen, was that her name? Or your name for her? the confrontation she had with the German. I found myself wondering now after that,
so,
was
yeah.
that an iconic story for
Well,
her?
and that one and the Royce story of him reflecting about what happened after the library burned, those are the two ones that come to mind as
Yeah.
crucial ones for them, and perhaps there's no accident, then they're the ones I decided to use here. I think Robin had it.
Robin has a question in back.
I think it's kind of, this is great what you said, because I think that's a great point. Back home, some of my anthropology colleagues have given me great tips about how to talk to people, and particularly letting people talk for themselves rather than a more sociological approach or something. But my question has to do with the later writings. I forget if it was Shannon or Christine who was talking about how comfortable are all of you with, you know, kind of getting out of historian mode a little bit and getting into psychology mode a bit, meaning talking about these ego documents as historical after effects, as opposed to documents that get you to the origin of the effect, right? Because these events, sometimes they're personally traumatic, sometimes they're traumatic on a social scale, you know, they have these ongoing after effects, and the story of those after effects can be really important. What do you have to say about that?
I would just say you're right. And I thought of trauma frequently in reading these women's stories about this period. And I think I'm also reminded of, you know, Bonnie Smith's analysis of the women historians, and trauma is a very important part of her analysis for a kind of author of history who was a woman in the 19th century. But I think you're absolutely right, Robin. Trauma is very important in these accounts. I think it's there. I think it's partly what generates the accounts, as well as perhaps explains some of the disruptions in those accounts, because they're very traumatic. I mean, these people were displaced. You know, their lives were completely overturned, and these are the elites. You know, but they were. It was traumatic.
Yeah, if I think I understand your question. I mean, sometimes the stories are cultural artifacts themselves, whether they're true or not, right? And I was thinking about your story of the confrontation, like the way she wished she might have reacted to the Prussian soldier, however she reacted. This is the way she wished and it sounded like that's the way you were using. You were talking about, it's not really whether it's true or not, but this is what the experience was like. She talks about it this way, whether she reacted that way, you know, in the Ronchian sense, was it as it really was or not, doesn't really matter. And that's the thing about memories, right? We, you know, that people, especially in wartime, and this is really true, combat memories are, and Tim O'Brien famously talks about this. And I think the First World War is a great example of, you know, Otto Dix and others, Robert Graves, if you read Samuel Heinz's book, The Soldier's Tale, several moments in there where he talks about these memoirs, these stories they tell, and he knows they're actually probably not true at all. But they're trying to express a sense of the strangeness of war and the trauma of war. And so it's not the truth of them, it's the feeling, right, that's created by the story that they're telling. Right? And that gets you at some of the after effects, some of the sort of the historical reality, a cultural history that may not tell you exactly what happened when a woman walked up to a Prussian officer, but does tell you what it was like to go through that kind of experience and what it might, the effect it might have on self-understanding and that sort of thing.
Can I push a little further and take it to a multi-generational level? That's even
what do you mean a multi-generational?
Which is that these after effect stories continue to be told.
Yeah,
Yes.
And they continue to be told by multiple generations.
And then they become true,
Yes.
even though they're not, right? Right, right.
We have time for one or two more questions or comments. Okay, we'll give you all a break before the talk by John Merriman. Thank you so much for coming.